The rumble of drums, the smell of soot, and screams echoing of stone walls. You stand at the foot of a city that seems impregnable, and you ask yourself, how can you break through this wall several meters thick, built from enormous stone blocks? The Romans found an answer, but the price of this answer was time, blood, and inhuman endurance. And at the end of this story, you'll have to ask yourself, could you have endured what was happening inside the Roman battering ram? Historians wrote, already during the siege of Greek cities in southern Italy in the 3rd century BCE, the Romans began using heavy wooden structures covered with leather and iron. Polybius mentioned that such machines changed the course of sieges. Where walls were considered eternal, a crack appeared. Imagine a huge wooden frame covered with raw bull hides. This was not just protection, this was the ram itself. Its heart, a long shaft suspended on chains that could accelerate and strike stone with force comparable to an animal's ram. It was from this image that the name was born, Aris, ram, the Roman word for a battering ram. The hide stretched over the frame absorbed the smell of smoke and burning. Raw hides were chosen not by chance, they held moisture longer and did not ignite from arrows with burning pitch. Inside the ram, darkness, the rumble of impacts, and the feeling that you are inside a living creature that breathes with you. Caesar in his notes wrote that without rams, the walls of Gaul could be stormed for weeks, but with them, cracks appeared after just a few hours of impacts. This was a tool that broke not only stone, but also the will of the besieged. And here, for the first time, a key term appears, vinila. This is what they called the movable wooden shelters that protected the legionnaires while they brought the ram closer to the wall. Essentially, these were the first movable shields on wheels, made to bring destruction closer. And yet, no protection could hide the tension that the legionnaires experienced. To go out under the walls, listen to stones and burning oil flying from above, and drag on yourself a machine weighing several tons, this was not just a military assignment. This was a challenge to the human limit. But what made the Romans believe that wood and iron could break stone that had protected cities for centuries? The answer lies in their preparation. And that's exactly what we'll approach next. You can hear it before you see it. The creaking of wood, the blows of axes, the clank of iron against nails. This is not a battlefield, but a giant workshop under the open sky. Before the first blow of the ram resounds against the city walls, the Romans turned the camp into a factory of destruction. Here was born the living beast that was meant to break through what seemed eternal. Sources report that such machines were built right at the siege site. Livy wrote that entire detachments of engineers were allocated for this, fabri, subordinated to the military tribune. These were not warriors with swords, but masters of the axe and saw, without whom the army could not have broken cities. And in their hands, each plank turned into part of the future ram. Now imagine dozens of oak logs laid out in a row, and people carrying them on their shoulders. The weight of just the shaft that would become the heart of the ram could reach several hundred kilograms. To suspend it on chains required blocks and ropes stretched with precision comparable to the mechanisms of modern cranes. This shaft was called Aris, ram, because its strikes against walls resembled the furious collision of a horned animal. Inside the camp, everything was subject to calculation. Archaeological finds show the Romans used wooden wheels and iron hoops, so the ram could be rolled right up to the walls. But the structure itself was vulnerable to fire, and here a special detail emerged. The raw hides we already encountered. They were expensive, and their delivery required caravans with provisions and water. Sometimes a siege consumed more supplies than the battle itself. At this moment a new term appears, testudo. This was the formation of legionnaires who walked alongside the ram, covering it with shields. Imagine a huge turtle of bronze and wood slowly approaching the walls. Without this living wall of people, the machine itself wouldn't have lasted an hour under fire. And you must understand the scale. To move the ram required dozens of soldiers. They pushed the machine, doused the hides with water, held the beams, and all while hearing stones raining down from above. They knew that at any moment the ram's roof could cave in, and inside it became a trap. But they still kept moving forward. Modern historian Goldsworthy wrote that Rome's siege technology was not just a copy of the Greek. The Romans brought it to the limit of efficiency. They had precise calculations, logistics, division of duties. What other armies did by intuition, the Romans turned into a cold system. Now, imagine the preparation for the strike itself. First, the legionnaires formed a protective formation, carried the machine to the foot of the wall. Then, they attached the shaft, checked the chains, and only then did the first warriors go inside. It was dark there, stuffy, smelling of wet leather and pitch. And each of them understood. They were not just fighters, they were part of the machine itself. But even with perfect preparation, there was a moment of truth. When the ram's rumble first touched the wall, everything changed. The battle became a struggle of endurance. What the legionnaires experienced inside in the first minutes of impact, this will be our next stop. The first blow always sounded like a thunderclap. The silence hanging over the walls was torn by the sharp rumble of wood against stone. Inside the ram, everything shuddered. Beams trembled, chains creaked, and the heavy shaft like a living heart moved forward and back again and again, crashing into the stone flesh of the city. For those standing inside, this was not just sound. This was a rhythm that penetrated to the bones, turned breathing into short gasps, and thoughts into anticipation of the next blow. Ancient historians noted that the first minutes of the ram were decisive. Caesar wrote about how the defenders of Gaul reacted instantly. From above flew arrows, stones, torches with burning pitch. Everything that could break, burn, or at least delay the ram came crashing down from the heights. At this moment, the warriors inside the machine found themselves in a trap. If the roof held, they continued. If it broke, everyone died in a matter of seconds. And now imagine the darkness inside. The only light, strips of smoke and fire, seeping through the cracks. The air thick, filled with soot and the smell of wet leather. Warriors push heavy beams, synchronously accelerate the shaft, and each blow resonates with a rumble in their chests. Where you might want to breathe deeper, warriors learned to breathe shallowly, so as not to suffocate. This is the true adversus murum, battle against the wall, a term the Romans used to denote the beginning of an assault. At this moment, the figure of a centurion entered the arena. He was not outside, but often went inside the ram to keep the rhythm and prevent the warriors from losing sync. His voice drowned out the blows, short commands like hammer strikes. 1, 2, and the shaft struck the wall again. This was the peculiarity of the Roman army. Even inside the machine, where there seemed to be no room for order, discipline reigned. Archaeological finds in Jerusalem and Masada confirm. The first blows of rams left traces on walls like marks from a giant chisel. Stones began to crack and defenders understood time was working against them. But the beginning of the strike was the most tense moment. Either the wall would hold and the ram would burn, or the Romans would manage to establish themselves and turn each blow into a step toward breakthrough. Now pay attention to details. Warriors pushing the machine carried on themselves weight no less than 20 kilograms of equipment. Their armor, shields, helmets heated under the sun, turning into an oven. Under the ram in the darkness, this heat intensified. And that's exactly why soldiers with water amphora always walked nearby. They watered the ram's hide, they gave drink to warriors, they extinguished the first tongues of flame. Without this support chain, the machine would die in the first minutes. A new term is born right here, catapult. Although catapults are separate siege weapons, they were often used parallel with the ram. While some struck the wall, others knocked the defenders off the walls to reduce pressure on the ram. This was like modern tactical support. Without fire cover, any advance becomes suicide. And yet, even with support, the beginning of the ram was always a test. Blow after blow, stone began to yield, but warriors inside felt every second how the wall resisted. It groaned but did not surrender. This was a struggle not only of army against city, but of men against stone. And here the main question arises. How many blows are needed for stone to surrender? How much strength is needed to turn a crack into a breach? The answer to this lay in the climax we have already approached closely. The rumble became deafening. Each new blow of the ram resonated not only in stone, but in the bodies of warriors inside. It seemed that their bones too began to crack in rhythm with the wall. From outside, this sound resembled the beats of a huge drum of war. Inside, it turned into unbearable vibration that made ears ring. It was at this moment that the real test began. The wall started to yield. Polybius wrote that when the first cracks appeared in stone masonry, the city began to panic. Defenders understood they had only hours, sometimes minutes, to stop the Roman ram. They brought the heaviest stones to the walls, prepared barrels with burning pitch, threw iron hooks down trying to hook and overturn the machine. And all this came crashing down on legionnaires who remained inside in the wooden darkness. Now imagine this spectacle. From above flies a huge block, strikes the ram's roof, and the entire frame shudders. Dust falls into eyes, beams crackle, but the machine holds. Warriors inside lose the rhythm, but the centurion raises his voice again. He shouts, drowning out the crash, returning breath to the rhythm of blows. This rhythm, the only thing that keeps them from chaos. The technical detail here becomes decisive, the suspension. The ram's shaft hung on chains and ropes, and it was precisely this that allowed it to accelerate. The term for this construction was suspensura. Without it, the ram could not deliver blows with such force. And with it, each acceleration turned into a blow that shook the ground beneath their feet. And then a turning point occurred. Stone began to split, first a small crack, then a crunch that even the besieged could hear. This was like the sound of ice breaking in spring, only 100 times louder. And with each blow this crack widened. Warriors inside the ram knew they stood on the threshold of breakthrough. But this very moment was the most deadly, dangerous. Livy mentioned that cities often tried to make a sortie precisely when the ram began to win. A sudden strike from the gates, a night attack, fire carried in darkness. For this the Romans always kept a reserve nearby. The legate commanding the siege distributed detachments in advance. Some struck the walls, others covered the ram, a third stood ready to meet the enemy at the gates. Archaeology confirms that such battles cost dozens, sometimes hundreds of lives in one night. In Masada were found traces of fires and collapses that show defenders fought desperately. But the Roman machine slowly, step by step, still brought the denouement closer. Sensory details here become especially harsh. Heat from burning pitch, stench of burning, screams of the wounded, crash of wood and stone, all this mixed into one nightmarish orchestra. And warriors inside the ram knew, while they strike, while the rhythm is not broken, the city has only one future, a breach. And it is precisely here that a new term enters the game, cohort. This is not just a military unit, this was the backbone of the Roman army. When a hole appeared in the wall, it was precisely the cohort that first burst inside. That is, people who had just pushed and defended the ram became the first to take the breach by storm. The climax always ended the same way. A scream, a crash, collapse. Stone surrendered. The wall, considered impregnable for centuries, suddenly turned into a pile of debris. And at this moment the entire city understood. Next would begin the most terrible. But what was this end like for the besieged? What did the ram's denouement mean not only for stone, but for people inside and outside? The wall did not collapse immediately. First, only individual stones began to fall out. Then a crack, like black lightning, cut through the masonry. The last blow of the ram sounded as if the earth itself was collapsing. Stone blocks rolled down, raising a cloud of dust, and suddenly, before the legion, opened a breach. For the besieged, this was a moment of horror. For the Romans, a signal for the decisive rush. Appian wrote that it was precisely at this moment that the outcome of the siege became obvious. No city could hold if the ram brought the matter to a breach. But along with this moment came the most cruel stage of battle. Now war turned into hand-to-hand combat. Every stone, every fragment became a weapon. You must imagine what was happening inside the ram in the last minutes before the assault. Warriors who for hours had pushed the heavy machine now had to drop the beams, break out, and be first to enter the breach. Where a second ago they heard the rumble of blows, now the clang of swords and spears awaited them. This transformation from machine builders to assault troops was the essence of Roman discipline. Here the legate entered the scene, supreme commander of the siege. His decision determined everything, whether to immediately throw cohorts into the breach or wait until the dust settled. Modern historian Sabin noted that such minutes were the most dangerous for Romans. Too early an assault could lead to the death of hundreds of warriors. Too late allowed defenders to fortify the breach. A new term sounds especially vivid here: Ordo. This is what Romans called battle order. The breach could not be taken in chaos. Legions moved in ordo, clear lines that broke the remnants of resistance. Imagine a wave rolling onto shore, first narrow but dense, then wider and wider. So too cohorts filled the breach, turning the hole in the wall into a new border of Rome. Archaeological finds in Numantia show, after breakthrough by ram, Romans left nothing to chance. At the site of destroyed gates, they found charred beams and traces of many bodies. This means the battle continued to the last defender. And here came the moment rarely spoken of. What became of the ram after the breach was made? It remained behind, dead and burned out, like a consumed beast. It was no longer pushed, no longer watered. Warriors abandoned it, as soldiers leave a shield on the battlefield. The machine that for hours had breathed with them became simply a pile of wood and leather. But it was precisely in this death of the ram that its victory lay. It lived a short, furious life and died at the moment when the city surrendered. And here it's important to remember the numbers. Polybius wrote that during major sieges, for example Syracuse, constructing rams took weeks, sometimes months. But one successful blow could decide a city's fate in a matter of hours. The price of these blows was measured not only in time and wood, but in the lives of hundreds of legionnaires. For Rome the denouement was always the same. The breach became gates. The city either surrendered, seeing that resistance was meaningless, or perished in ruins. For legionnaires, this was the end of one nightmare and the beginning of another. Those who spent hours inside the ram now had to step where Rome was bursting in, into homes, streets and people's fates. And it is precisely here that a new question arises. If stones yielded to iron and wood, then what happened to the hearts of those who found themselves inside this machine? When the breach was taken and the city fell, the ram's fate seemed decided. It was no longer needed, and yet it is precisely here that the key to understanding Roman strength lies hidden. The ram was not just a machine, it was a symbol that human will could break through even stone. And this was the main lesson that Rome left to posterity. Tacitus wrote that a siege without a ram could drag on for months, but with one everything was decided in a matter of days. The numbers confirm, if an ordinary assault cost hundreds of death for each meter of wall, then ram blows cut these losses in half. The ram became a weapon of time. It stole it from defenders and gave it to legionnaires. But what happened to those who stood inside this machine? Their bodies ached from blows, ears rang for days, eyes watered from smoke and stench. For them the ram was not just a weapon, but a prison where they had to endure for hours. Modern researchers note this was an experience on the edge of human endurance, and that's exactly why such warriors were considered the elite of discipline. Here a new term is born, disciplina. In Roman understanding, this was not just the word discipline. This was the idea that each warrior is only part of a mechanism, and the machine works while each fulfills his role. The ram was the physical embodiment of this idea, wood, iron and people bound into one whole. Archaeology confirms this image. In Jerusalem were found traces of breaches in walls and remains of charred structures. These finds show the ram lived and died with the siege. Its remains stayed in the ashes, and with them the memory of how the Roman army broke cities. But most important, the long-term consequences. After the siege wars in Gaul and Judea, Roman technology became the standard for future armies. Medieval armies copied Roman principles, though they could not always repeat their effectiveness. Even modern military doctrines recognize, without logistics, discipline and technology, no force can take a fortress. Now let's return to the question we left at the beginning. What was happening inside the Roman battering ram? There was no heroism in the usual sense. There was heat, darkness, stench, blows and fear. But it was precisely men's ability to endure this that turned wood and iron into a weapon that changed the fates of empires. And now imagine yourself in their place. Hours in darkness, in thunder, in heat, pushing a machine that could at any second catch fire and bury you beneath it. Could you have endured this? Could you have become part of the Ram, part of a nameless force that breaks stone? Everyone gives their own answer to this question, but one thing is clear. It was precisely such warriors, such machines, and such discipline that made Rome what it is in history. And when we look today at the ruins of ancient cities, we see not only stones, we see traces of rams, traces of iron will that left its blow in eternity. Now, knowing this story, you can ask yourself what remains in you from those people who bore blows in the darkness of the Ram. And if tomorrow a wall stands before you, not of stone but of difficulties, will you have enough strength to break through it?